Empowerment Radio Network. Empowerment Radio Network.
Hi, thank you for holding. Welcome to the Bev Smith Show.
It's the Empowerment Radio Network. Get empowered.
And we'll just talk, you and I, about what's happening in America.
Inspiring, motivating, empowering. It's the Empowerment Radio Network.
Well, let me get your definition, Mr. People Scholar, on what you call progress.
Empower yourself so that you can empower others. This is the Empowerment Radio Network. Get empowered.
Hi, thank you for holding. Welcome to the Bev Smith Show.
Inspiring, motivating, empowering. This is the Bev Smith Show. Get empowered.
So hello there. How are ya? How are ya? How are ya? Hope you're having a wonderful day and you've settled back to spend some time with Miss Bev as we talk you through this day. And we have a lot to talk about. This year's election is an important one because there are a lot of segments in our population now debating on who has a right to vote and who should not vote. One of the issues being debated around the country is should the right to vote be returned to inmates who are in prison. And as I was talking to someone about this issue, I said to the Maccabee sisters, who are our favorite lawyers in the whole wide world, I said, you know, we need to talk about this whole thing of prisoners, the new racism, because that's exactly what it is, the new plantation, that's exactly what I think prisons are today, and the new workforce, slave force, I should say. And I said to Brooke, find me someone who can explain everything to me. And he said, I have just the man to talk to you about and for you to talk to. He's the executive director of the Sentencing Project. And let me just tell you a little bit about him because his resume is so impressive. But he wrote a groundbreaking book, Race to Incarceration, Race, R-A-C-E, on how sentencing policies led to explosive expansion in the U.S. prison population. And not only that, but in some communities where they are building new jails, particularly in places like Pennsylvania, they are the new employers of communities that have been devastated by the loss of steel mills, the deadening of the coal industry, and, of course, trade overseas. Well, Marc Marr knows all about it, and I want to talk to him. Marc Marr, the executive director of the Sentencing Program. I can't talk today. Hi, Marc. How are you?
Well, I'm great, and thanks so much for having me here.
Well, thanks so much for agreeing to talk with us. You know, people hint at this topic, but they don't really talk about it. It is not, doesn't seem to be that popular in this year's election at any level, whether it is local, state, or national. Why?
Well, I think some of it's good news and some of it's bad news. The good news is that, you know, crime rates have actually been going down the last 15 years or so, and there's a debate on about why they're going down. But nonetheless, I think many people in this country feel a little safer than they may have in the 80s or 90s, and so the issue is a little less politicized as a result. But the other problem, the reason it's not being talked, it concerns me, and that is if you listen to the campaign speeches at both parties' conventions, you'd almost think that, you know, everybody in this country is now comfortably middle class. Well, all we hear about is the middle class. We don't hear that we have a record number of people in our prison system, that we lead the world in locking people up behind bars. Very little discussion about the issues of race, class, and poverty that I think in many ways are going hand in hand with this explosion in the prison system.
Well, as we talk about the explosion in the prison system, and naturally I have a suspicious mind if you know anything about Bev Smith, I'm thinking one of the reasons why we don't talk about it is because it is a black issue. It is a poor issue. Poor whites, poor Spanish-speaking, and Native Americans. We need to add them to the bunch, but in particular poor blacks. And that this is, in my opinion, another way of controlling us through the system which we are now seeing is unjust, thanks to our Attorney General. So I'm thinking that the first part of your book, Race, R-A-C-E, is at the core of this whole thing. Race, money, and control.
Well, you know, I would say I don't know that, you know, we necessarily had a group of, wealthy white male capitalists sitting around a room plotting ways that they could control the African American population. But if you look at the results of policies of recent decades, it certainly looks very much as if something like that had happened. I think a lot of this has to do with changes in the larger economy. It has to do with globalization and sort of decisions made one way or another that certain communities just don't have a role in our economic system. It also feeds into, I think, the whole punitive approach that has taken over politics in many areas, that, if you haven't made it successfully on your own, well, then we've got a place for you, and that place is often called prison. And the fact that these are largely people of color behind bars means that for far too many Americans, this is a problem that's best left behind those prison walls, and we don't have to look at it, we don't have to think about it. I think people do need to think about it. I think they're fooling themselves if they don't, but nonetheless, that's how it comes across for far too many people.
You and I are going to be friends, and we're going to invite you back many, many times, but I'm going to take a little issue with you. You said you don't think it's a conspiracy. You don't see a group of white men sitting around talking about it, but I do. I saw a group of conservative white male Republicans in Pennsylvania talk about redistricting the vote in Florida, redistricting the vote in Georgia, blocking out African American and Latino populations, and willing to sacrifice well-to-do, shall I say, white, middle, and elderly to sacrifice stopping blacks from having such a block. That was thorough. They tried it. It's being discussed and debated in courts right now. And in Pennsylvania last week, the effort of the Republicans, one who stood on the steps of the Capitol and said, well, finally, the state of Pennsylvania will go Republican because we did it. We did it. We got rid of those areas. So what I'm wondering is, could we change your thoughts about whether or not it is deliberate? Because when you look at where the prisons are, and when you look at where they're building them, and when you look at who they put in charge, if they were opening up the hiring in these towns to all of the people, some who look like you and me, some who don't, then maybe I would agree with you. But this thing is almost scientific. And hasn't it been all along when you look at the history of blacks being thrown into the prison system, whether it's Mississippi, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or New York City?
When it comes to the voting rights and the spate of ID laws and things like that, I would absolutely agree with you. This is, it's not as if, 30 different governors all of a sudden decided they had this problem that absolutely had to be dealt with right now. I think it's no coincidence in election year. My only issue is maybe it's a fine point or so. When we look at the prison explosion per se, many people benefit off of that. Absolutely. People in rural communities who think they're going to get jobs from new prisons, the contractors go into prisons, and the like. All I'm saying is I don't know that we necessarily had a small group of people who said this is the way we can enrich some people at the expense of others, but all the policies they've enacted have done exactly that. So whether it was intentional or whether it was malign neglect or whatever we might want to call it, the outcome seems pretty clear-cut, and I think even if we give the policymakers the benefit of the doubt, let's assume for the moment that was not their intention. Nonetheless, once they see the consequences of all those decisions, the failure to act at that point speaks volumes, I think.
We're talking with Marc. He is the executive director of the Sentencing Project, and he has quite a resume in this area. He began his work in criminal justice with the American Friends Services Committee. Right away, we liked him, and served as the organization's National Justice Communications Coordinator. He has received the Helen, Buttenwieser Award,
yes, right,
for the Fortune Society in 1991, the Donald Cressy Award from the National Council on Crime and Delinquency. See, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking question to him. Because if we're looking at the prison system, we now have to add a new component, and that is not just the adult prison system, Marc, but we have to look at what they're doing to young black men.